stretch-mediated hypertrophy. What the hell does that even mean? Ready, set, go.
Hypertrophy induced by intense stretching, right? Either in lengthened partials or intense overwork stretching.
Yeah, I think so. There's two main things that come into this, like hypertrophy, meaning muscle growth, right? So the growth of the tissue within the muscle cells. And then two, the stretch, right? And what does that mean? And we can talk about that a little bit, but I think most people have heard that term before. They know what that is. They've experienced what stretching feels like, what it feels like to quote unquote stretch a tight muscle or a tight group of muscles and kind of what that feeling is. And so this stretch mediated hypertrophy is a concept that has started to come into proof in the laboratory specific to a few studies that have happened. Now, there's been a lot of studying around stretching, a lot of study around stretching. And so we kind of have to talk about like, what does that mean? What is stretching? What is an actual stretch? How do we define that? Because I think there's a lot to be talked about there. Like what are you actually doing when you're quote unquote stretching something versus what you're not doing? But there's again, some interesting studies that have recently come out that are getting some attention specific to if I stretch muscles for a period of time, we'll define this and kind of what it says, for a period of time under a fairly intense load, that I could actually get some muscle growth out of that as compared to actually doing some resistance training for the same muscle group. So it's popped up, it's kind of gotten popular, it repopularized to a certain extent. And what I mean by that is it's like stretching muscles as it relates to muscle growth is not a new concept. For a long, long time, there's been a lot of anecdote around like you stretch to help grow, things like creating more space within the tissues, like, and particularly like the saran wrap that goes around the muscle tissues we call fascia. Could that be inhibiting or restricting how much growth you can get in a particular group of muscles or muscle because it just simply doesn't have any room to grow? So there's that concept. There's also the concept of helping your, creating more mobility within the tissue so that you can train those muscles, that the muscles that you are attempting to train, you can train them to a fuller range of motion, thereby impacting muscle growth a little bit more. I mean, there's been a ton. There's also like, does it increase flexibility? In some cases, yes. In other cases, no. Does it increase mobility? Some cases, yes. In other cases, no. There's a lot of study, I guess, is the point. So I think what you see whenever there's all the study out there and people are looking for a specific answer on something that supports or flies in the face of whatever answer they want, they start to kind of do some funny things with the research. I've probably been guilty of that. I think we all have been, just with like a confirmation bias type of approach to certain things. That's just human nature. It's just what we do. And let's be honest, there's no shortage of information out there, so it can all get a little confusing sometimes. So take the human nature, plus the fact that there's too much information a lot of times, coupled with the like, why does this even fucking matter, part. Just go work out. It mostly comes down to somebody has something to sell, or at the end of the day, or they have, and maybe that's their credential. Or maybe that's their, whoever funded the study as this supports some product or whatever else, new theory. The interesting part about why we brought this up today is there is some new research that suggests that, again, stretching can create, when things are equated, can create the same amount of muscle hypertrophy that, say, a specific exercise might under certain circumstances. Now, in the past, we've seen these studies done, and as of very recently, they're mostly done around animals, not a lot of human study. And as we just sort of stated, some funny things can happen sometimes when we see stuff. People try to expand or extrapolate these results from animal studies into, what might happen in humans. You can't do that. Like we talk about this. We talk about things like time-restricted feeding, the research that got done there a long time ago that created a whole firestorm of the things that we see out there, and those are done in mice. right? And again, the results were extrapolated. Well, if it happens here, then we can expect it can happen here, which couldn't be any further from the truth, as we've started to kind of realize and find out. There's not all of it can't be translated over, but you can't just say because it looks this way here, it would look that way there. And so anyway, with this new evidence, it's kind of brought up a couple of things and some things to kind of think about. So anyway, that's why we're here today, and that's what we're going to talk about. So for those people that are wondering about, should I be to stretch or not to stretch? And the reasons why we should or shouldn't in terms of what our goals are.
Well, and I think it's important to, as we dive into this, define the difference between this form of stretching where it's intense, it's very active, it's very focused. Maybe the goal is to upregulate a system or create tension in the muscle, mechanical tension, versus when we think of, a lot of people think of stretching, and that's a whole other discussion of, is this very passive, turned off, relaxing, downregulation effect, which may have its place, but there's some nuance again with that as well.
Yeah, so if we took a look at some of the common things that people understand about stretching, I think there's a few things that have come up over the years that we all know about that people recognize. Like one would be ballistic stretching, right? That's like the bouncing piece that goes into it. The old example would be the old cherry picker from when I was in junior IPE. We'd start the day with our calisthenics, and one of those calisthenics would be legs out, or feet outside hips, sort of spread, wide, way outside shoulders even. Standing, legs straight, reaching straight down with hand over hand, trying to touch the ground, right? And you would kind of bounce, right? And with each bounce, you would try to get a little deeper into, let's say hip flexion, into spinal flexion with those straight legs again. And you're trying to reach back with each bounce a little further behind you onto the ground or to the floor. And you'd be bouncing into this. We call them cherry pickers. I don't know if you ever had to do those, but I had to do them. They were right after what we at the time called burpees, which look different than what most people understand burpees to look like now. Those type of things, which was immediately followed by a shit ton of push-ups and a shit ton of sit-ups. A lot of things that we did that we don't even do anymore, it's not even compulsory to have junior high PE anymore. So I don't even know if some of the people listening to this would even know what the hell I'm talking about. But the point of that is ballistic stretching. And we were told after a while, don't do ballistic stretching. There is no value to this. Well, that depends.
Yeah.
Because when we start to look at plyometrics, that ballistic stretching is extremely valuable in terms of eliciting power and a response out of the elastic components that those tissues do have, as an example.
Yeah, like an extensive plyo where your focus is on actually the tendon and being, springy and ballistic with that junction. So different intention, but
right. So before it was like, here's how we warm up, here's how we get more flexible. At least that's how it was being sold. Down the line, there may be some truth to that, but probably applying it in that way for that under that context doesn't really work. There's some other forms of stretching that people might kind of, particularly if you're into the fitness game and you've been around for a while, and particularly in the last 15 maybe years, some of the things that may have come across across the table for you that you may have tried or applied.
15 or even 25 or 30 as far as are you referring to PRNF?
Yeah, well, as an example, we'll talk about that one real quick.
Yeah, so there's different methods of applying this type of stretch. So some of the, I'm going to just throw this out there. So it's contract, relax, hold, contract, relax, and then there's a reverse.
There's a reciprocal inhibition or an autonomic inhibition. So it's where you're contracting the muscle at long lengths, contract, relax, or you can also come into play with the antagonistic muscle contracting in the lengthened position so if your hamstring is in a lengthened position, you're contracting the quad hip flexor, and that has an inhibitory effect on the hamstring.
Sorry, I was just talking about the three methods of general terminology that was used, or that I guess am familiar with or have learned in applying it. So anyway, I don't. But
crack,
yes.
Yeah. Contract, relax.
Contract, relax.
Antagonist, contract. All right, the basics behind proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation are, it is an active form of stretching where you're working, utilizing your muscles to either pull you into more of a stretch and or to relax and effectively be moved passively into a longer or greater range of motion and lengthen the muscle tissue, connective tissue that's involved with whatever it is what we're trying to affect there. A lot of this stuff, is very heavily utilized, say, in the in the physical therapy world, still is today. There's still a lot of validity behind it. It can also be used as strengthening, right? So for those people that are very weak or they're coming off of surgery, let's say they have a limited range of motion because ACL, right? So when you come out, one of the things that's really important is we regain that range of motion to full extension, and flexion at the knee immediately following surgery. A lot of issues there, right? We've got swelling, we've got fluid retention, we've got pain. Those are all restrictions that we have to get through. And so this PRNF stuff can be used initially to help with all of those, right? But more specifically, like at that point when you are sort of in your weakest or most vulnerable state, you can get hands-on with the practitioner, and the practitioner can be adding resistance where it needs to be to strengthen one area while getting the other area that maybe be like hyper excited and trying to contract and be switched on to get that area to relax. Yeah. So it is a form of quote unquote stretch.
Yeah. And I think it's that kind of stretching, it's very neurological of, you can argue that tightness is kind of the nervous system protecting this range of motion. I don't trust that range of motion. So this kind of stretching can almost feel like magic of like, you have this big increase of range of motion almost immediately, oftentimes, because it's telling the nervous system like, oh, you can contract, you're calming the nervous system down. And it's building that range of motion through either form of it. So
and through practice and constant repetition, you can kind of train that into the system to relax, which is good as long as you are matching that with. So what we've done is we've increased range. We also need to increase strength within that range. So it needs to oftentimes be coupled with the strength training component, however that's applied, whether that's through outside modalities, or it's just simply body weight movement. There's all kinds of things that you could be doing there. We don't have to get into that. The bottom line is like, okay, now we have this new range. What do we do with it? Right? So this is similar from the nervous system perspective when we talk about things like foam rolling.
Oh, yeah.
And we've talked about that on the show before, and we swore that was going to be the last time we ever talked about it. But I think for reference, it's important that we bring it up again, and just that the same thing that you just described is what's happening with foam rolling. We are shutting down sort of, or let's just say interrupting this nervous system signal, which we can take advantage of, right? Particularly say at the beginning of a set while there is some level of down regulation, which could, in theory, allow some up regulation of the opposite side, the reciprocal side. Again, if I can get the hip flexors to calm down a little bit, right? And I could maybe get the hamstrings to maybe calm down a little bit. That is what's going on through my extensors on the backside. It may allow me to get down into maybe a little bit of a deeper squat position, which would then allow me to train those muscles at a range that I wouldn't typically be able to train them at. And that's going to play into what we're going to talk about here today with regard to training things at a lengthened state and the advantages that you can get from a hypertrophy perspective when training at a lengthened state, almost like at an exposed state. So we'll leave it at that, I think, and come back to it. So that's another form of quote unquote stretch that you could be thinking about. That's a little bit more active once you've now kind of down regulated the system. So the foam rolling isn't a stretch. It's what you're able to do once you've down regulated the nervous system in terms of getting deeper into a range of motion, which, if you really look at it, is getting into a stretch. Yeah. You're getting into a longer position.
A loaded stretch.
Stretch.
Range of motion. And maybe it's dynamic, but I love that kind of intention with people that, and this can be neurologically of how stressed they are and tight and all this and things like on that side of things, but applying this immediately prior to their workout, because it unlocks these ranges of motion. Sitting on a foam roller for 45 minutes at night probably doesn't have that much of an effect, and people can argue with the static stretching. But when you apply this correctly to the right amount, and it opens this range to allow you to get to a deeper squat, that's going to help you gain muscle, because now you can squat to a range that you couldn't beforehand. So that's how I love applying that form of stretching outside of that. So
yeah, there's pros and cons, right? So there's all these different applications for all these different things. So recent study comes out, basically works like this. And by the way, this study comes out after a previous study. And let me talk about the previous study for a second. Effectively, what they were doing was studying loaded stretching for periods of time and seeing what was happening from a muscle hypertrophy perspective. And they were doing this with animals, and they were also looking at the human gastroc. But there was a lot of room in between, like to understand kind of what was really going on. But effectively, the animals that were using were birds. And they were putting the wing of these birds under basically under a loaded stretch. And they were watching some level of a hypertrophy happening within that bird wing musculature. Then again, they were kind of looking at the gastroc and what was happening with the gastroc when the gastroc was being put at a very long length. So they were thinking of your gastroc being your calf muscle, right? And think about when you're standing, right? And with your heels hanging over a step or something like that, and you go deep into the stretch. Now, this is not new. Like we've from a science perspective, we know that there can be a tremendous amount of strength gained through strength, not necessarily hypertrophy though, strength gained by training the muscles at a lengthened position.
So kind of going also into a deficit there.
Yes. So think about it as a deficit calf raise, if you will, similar to like a deficit deadlift. But with the calves, there's a lot less going on. We're talking about the ankle, right? The gastroc crosses the knee, so we have to understand what's going on at the knee too, and the ankle. But there's a lot less variables than say doing like a deficit deadlift or Romanian deadlift. When
You're talking like isolation.
I'm talking about isolating it, being able to study it.
Yeah,
being able to study it. It's smaller muscles. There's not a lot of things happening there.
Less technique needs to go
so many things. So when you look at this previous study, they're looking at it, they're going, oh, we're seeing some shit with these bird wings. This is interesting. And so they published this thing, I believe it was last summer, it was like August of last year is when it finally got published. And with that, basically the same group of scientists, exercise physiologists or whatnot, are looking at it going, well, we should take this to the next level. People want to see, well, let's see what happens in human trials. So they take what they found and they move into a new human trial, which had just been published, I believe, in December of 2023, or maybe just beginning of this year. It was January 2024. So this thing just came out. And interestingly, what they looked at this was purely done on humans, and it was done on the pec muscles. And so what was happening was they were looking at 4 bouts per week of 15-minute sessions each of heavily loaded, and this is where it gets a little like gray, but heavily loaded pec stretching, right, against another group which was doing 5 sets of 12 repetitions 3 times per week of basically a chest hypertrophy exercise. And what they found was, effectively, the results were the same in terms of muscle hypertrophy across the board. So people listening to this going, wait, what? Yeah. So basically a very, very specific, heavily loaded stretch, 4 bouts of this per week for 15 minutes at a time. The equipment, there was equipment used here. It was heavily loaded. Where they were doing, I believe, both sides at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah. And as compared to another group that was doing basically a chest press exercise 3 times per week for 5 sets of 12 repetitions. So at to near failure. Basically going back to this is where it gets a little gray, going back to the stretch side of it. The stretch group was, how much were they really actually loading these people? Well, that's going to be different based on the individual, but the basic general overall thing was to discomfort. That's a little gray. But again, what was really interesting is that with this stretching to discomfort, they were seeing equal amounts of muscle hypertrophy, that is growth, in that time period over an 8-week. This study went over 8 weeks. I don't know. I'm just going to lay that out there, or just kind of put that out there. Why is this interesting? And why should we even be talking about it?
Well, I think it's interesting, obviously, to show, that we can be in a held position and not be going through a range of motion and still have a lot of mechanical tension and produce a hypertrophy response. I don't know if there's any other studies that showed that long of an intense stretch with that intention.
Correct.
There's lots of studies on stretching,
Correct.
but not with the mindset of, hey, is this going to directly cause hypertrophy?
Yeah. As I say, there's also studies out there that support doing an isometric exercise and it creating strength. But as far as doing an isometric or a stretch at a lengthened state with a hypertrophic response, that's new.
Yeah, I think so. So I think where it's interesting is I think we're just at the precipice of how do we apply this?
Yep.
And what does that look like for training? So kind of like our other conversation, that shouldn't be necessarily that you throw out your rest of your training protocol. And I don't know.
With the bathwater?
Yeah. I don't know. For me, I mean, I'm pretty ADD. It's hard for me to hold, a plank for 30 seconds. For me to sit in an intense stretch for 15 minutes unbroken, that's hard for me to do. But I think we can start to extrapolate that we're going to probably see more data of what does the range actually look like. That was the protocol for the study, but how do we apply? Does it really need to be 15 minutes? Does it need to be less? How intense? What does that look like? Can this be a training tool in conjunction with the rest of your training? Could it be, for example, at the end of your workout that you're holding an intense stretch to kind of further continue the rest of your workout that you already did? So you're hitting chest, you're hitting it to these ranges of motions, and then at the end, you're holding an intense stretch for a given protocol, and then that's continuing this response.
So in the research study that you're talking about, when they did the 15-minute intense stretch, did they do any other chest exercise in this?
Yeah, that was very controlled. One of the things to understand about the subjects it was noted that they were physically active, like they do exercise, but not resistance trained.
Okay.
So part of, you're making an interesting suggestion there. Where does this fit in? Who does it fit in for? Does it fit in for the more advanced athlete or resistance trained individual, or is this more for the person that the untrained? And do those results stand up across the board? Obviously, a lot to understand here, but the research in and of itself and what they got out of it is new. So I think that's interesting to talk about. But to your point, it starts to fall into like, well, people practice some things within their current workouts now with an understanding that they will get certain things out of them or out of those exercises. Like we just mentioned that calf raise. We know that you're going to get more strength, or that you can elicit more strength by going into a full quote unquote stretch or full range of motion to a level of discomfort to some extent with that particular movement in order to get more strength out of the gastroc or calf muscles. This is stuff we've known about for a long time. People have sort of applied that across the board to like, hey, can we do that for the hamstrings? Can we do that for the quads? Can we do that for the biceps, the triceps? All of the things. Well, those studies haven't been done yet, but there's been a lot of information, I think, extrapolated out of there to try and make some assumptions, which we have to be careful about. This is the first time we've gotten some information that suggests that maybe even some of that extrapolated information may hold up as we go deeper into this. Again, why should people care about this? Here's why. Because I think people are already doing some level of this, maybe unknowingly, or knowingly, knowingly they're doing this, thinking it might give them a specific result, more specifically, more hypertrophy, because that's just the way we've done it forever, and we'll just keep doing it that way. And so-and-so over here who's jacked has been doing this, and they have this kind of result. So I should do that too. And what I'm more specifically speaking about are things like partial reps. You kind of alluded to this, Ryan, when you said, hey, where might this fit into our workouts? And if you get into most hypertrophy-focused exercise programs, specifically something like a physique program, you're going to probably find at some point in that routine, in that exercise program, you're probably going to find some partial reps programmed in there. Without this evidence that we're seeing right now, why? Right? Why? And it's been more anecdotal than anything else. However, there has been some study. I think you brought one up earlier as we were kind of debating this thing on the quads. What
Oh, that was based on, there's some kind of mixed data. It was on the quads and interset stretching.
Okay.
So that was different specifically than like the long lengths or the long lengths partials. But they're applying the study that we're talking about to long length partials. Like, what's the opinion on that? And so I think that's really, really popular right now, is training in long length partials. But how do we apply it? I think were you going to say something?
No, just listening to the conversation, one of the things that came to my mind that this is really reminding me of is BFR training. Blood flow restricted.
Yeah.
That 100% fits in here. Yeah. Go ahead. You want to talk about that?
Oh, well, I mean, just as far as, when would you apply it? Because it's not like you would apply that type of modality every single day.
Right,
every single week.
At the beginning of a workout versus the end.
Mm-hmm. And then looking at hypertrophy gains from blood flow restrictive types of training, it's usually more on your appendages, so arms, quads, maybe calves, I guess, for some individuals. I think of it more in the bodybuilding space than I do for performance. But I mean, that's just something that came to my mind. If I don't know, we wanted to touch on
100% fits into this, because these are the things people are doing as it relates to the term stretch, right? And volumization of the muscle cell and as it specifically relates to hypertrophy. So, just going back, we were talking about like this, interset stretching versus what they're doing here versus some other things that I've heard in the past. There's been some other people that have explored and actually sold some things, and I'm not going to mention any names, but specific to like fascial stretching during your workouts. Like again, we mentioned this at the beginning, like expanding the space that your muscles actually have to grow in, right? And again, who does this really apply to? Does this apply to the novice, exerciser, novice lifter? Probably not. What percentage of gains might you get from, if you're a very advanced bodybuilder who's got all kinds of things in their camp that might be working for them? I don't know. Those studies aren't going to get done. Like, they're probably never going to get done. So I don't think we're ever really going to know. But the point of this is there is some level of all of this stuff being applied. This is the first time in a long time, though, we've seen anything come out that suggests that, maybe stretching can help with muscle growth beyond the other things that we've just mentioned. So anyhow.
I think this really applies to, not just necessarily training long length partials, but training full range of motion. I think there was some debate. There's been some studies about like squats to parallel, squats to 90, squats to a full range, and what's the most effective. And I think this is supporting, even if you're not doing the long length partials and only working in that you should try to train to your maximal range of motion. And that's where you'll see the biggest effect for hypertrophy and strength and all these different things. I think it's supporting that kind of indirectly in some ways.
Yeah, I think the argument there is obviously use all of what you have if you can. And that's when we go back to talking about movement patterns. And really trying to master that movement pattern for you, whatever it is, whether we're talking about a squat or a push, a pull, whatever, that you're able to move with quality, there's quality movement through the entire range of motion. And if you don't have a good or entire range of motion, those are things you should be working on. Number one, if your goal is to just be healthier and be a better, more efficient mover. But number two, obviously, if you're going to be into this bodybuilding, physique, muscle hypertrophy game, or it's important for whatever it is that you're doing in life or in sport or whatever, that this makes perfect sense, that we would try and train there. What gets really odd to me is that people don't actually ever work on any of that stuff, but they're the first to jump into partial reps, right? And these wild, again, I'm not saying there's no validity to this, but I can't even get into a full squat. That's maybe not a good one. Well, no, I'll use it anyway. I can't get into a full squat, but goddamn, I'm doing blood flow restriction training at least 3 times a week.
Yes,
because it helps me. To me, it's just kind of a weird way of looking at it. They're grasping at all these other things before they have mastered the fundamentals or the basics. So I don't want to make too much of an argument there. Just that it's really important that you take a look at how your body is actually able to do the basic things and how those impact you on the bigger scale. And then how the smaller scale things, again, working in the margins with this, again, what we're talking about here is this stretch mediated hypertrophy, how that might then give you some level of advantage or help down the line. Again, so before you throw the baby out with the bathwater and change your entire protocol and go, oh, I'm going to, this is something I need to add on top of my 5 ice baths a week and all my red light therapy and whatever else. Again, there's validity in all that stuff, but like, where am I spending my time here?
Well, it's funny. Now that I'm thinking about it, I actually had a coach ask my opinion on this about a month ago of what I thought about length and partials. One of our new coaches. And he, what's my opinion on it? And I said, I think there's some merit. I think there's some data showing that, but I wouldn't apply it to a client most of the time until they have the fundamentals, until they have movement, until they can work through a range of motion, until they can control these things. And then it might be a tool, he was even asking specifically for his training of like, how do you apply it to that? And I think, yes, it can be a tool of how do we apply these length and partials? Should your whole workout, you go into the gym and only doing these like quarter reps? Well, first off, if you only did that, you might look kind of silly, I think. But I think it can be a tool maybe in something like a drop set or your last set when you're training. We've talked in a previous podcast of the benefits and the possible benefits of training close to failure. I think in certain blocks of your training, maybe you're trying to push closer to failure when you're managing these stressors. And you start to apply some long length partials at the drop set, at the last set, so you're not taking away from the other sets and things like that. So that's where it can be a tool for the more advanced lifter or the more experienced lifter, or you're trying to change things up or work through that. So,
yeah, it's an interesting thing. One of the things that I left out in terms of what one of the interesting results of this was increased flexibility for the stretch mediated group, those people that were working in the stretch group, which was interesting because the people on the other side that were doing the more traditional resistance training exercise did not get that same level of flexibility. So there was something to be said for that as well. To what degree? There's not a lot of detail there, but there was market across the board. They got more quote unquote flexible. Again, we talked about flexibility versus mobility. Is that a good thing versus a bad thing? I don't know. But what we have been told for a long, long time is don't do static stretching if you're trying to get more flexible. Study seems to show that might not necessarily be, entirely accurate. Again, like how are you applying this stuff? This is very different. So things to think about. But I want to go back to what you're saying is like, okay, so if we are going to try and apply this somewhere, and let's talk about those lengthened partial reps, where would I put this in my program? And you kind of alluded to where you would put that in. And I think you talked a little bit about, it's like, for example, where does the PRNF go in? Right, or where does the foam rolling go into an exercise program? Do you do that halfway through your workout to try and elicit, more range of motion in a potential weakened state where you've already done, or you've already taxed your nervous system or those heavier lifts or whatever? I'm gonna say no. It's probably not a good idea. It's probably not a place to put them. Not if you're looking to get the maximal result for whatever it is that you're doing. It should be very intentional. If my goal is to get into a deeper squat so that I can train through that full range of motion, if you're going to foam roll at the beginning, right?
Yes.
And then hit those areas while you're at your freshest, right? And you can maximize the loads and let's just say the resistance training components that go into growing muscle and building strength at the beginning when you're fresh, not probably later on down the line. Could there be an application for that? Yeah, we could debate that. There might be, but that's not where most people need to be. If you want to make an argument, everybody wants to make an argument about, but. I know there's always a but there's always a depends. I'm just saying for the general person. So going back to this, like, where would we add this intense stretch or these, more specifically, these lengthened partial reps? Where do you put them into your workout if the goal is hypertrophy, right? Because that's what we know this stuff does. Like, it so far, we can see that, like, in this lengthened state, we could elicit more growth. Again, there's a little bit of nuance around, like, well, how much resistance do they need? How much time does this need to be happening for? How frequently do we need to be doing it for? Again, these are all things that are not well understood. But if, Ryan, I put a gun to your head and I said, where would you tell me to put these in right now, knowing what we know? to maybe get the best result that I possibly can, where would you do it?
I would definitely apply it to. I wouldn't apply it to my first sets of an exercise, because I do think, and even that quad study put into mentioned that doing these intense lengthened positions can start to hinder performance. So if you're trying to gain more hypertrophy on your first set of your pull down and you do lengthened partials, and then that makes it where you can do fewer full range and effective reps on the second set, probably not
a great idea.
A great idea to do. But if you're doing your pull downs and it's your last set of pull downs, and I would even think about, okay, in my like what's my pull day? You can even go into that. But if it's my last set of pull downs and I'm really trying to to get the most out of that, that's where I would apply it. Or trying to train close to failure in general. If I'm in a big rush and maybe I, for that block, maybe I can only get in 2 sets, or sometimes I've even had it where I can only get in 1 set, then I'm going to make that set as intense as possible. And that's where I would apply it. So I think that's one part of it. And then I think the other side of this is managing, this is going to be stressful, right? Mm-hmm. This is going to be hard on your body. You're going to be really sore. Neurologically, you're going to be fatigued. So I would do this as a block of training. I would not have my training look like this year round, mm-hmm. because then it's kind of the same thing. At a certain point, you're probably going to not get the same effect.
Point of diminishing returns.
Right, exactly. So I would apply this for a block of training, maybe even a short block, right? Maybe if I'm really I've been grinding on my hypertrophy block. I've been really trying to put on as much muscle as I can. I feel like I'm kind of tapped out some of the other areas that I can work through. I'm going to do a 2-week block where I'm doing lots of lengthened partials as drop sets at the end to really just get the most that I can out of this last bit of my bulk before I cut or something like that.
Yeah. On top of that, of what you just said, as far as where I would put it in, I might even put it in, if we're talking about the lats, on a single arm pull day. Mm-hmm. So, when we're going to like a low position, when we're doing single arm pulling, that's where I might even put it in as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I love that advice. I think it's good, solid advice based on what we know. However, I'll say this: it's still very anecdotal.
Yes,
we're making some guesses based on some of the things that we know, but I still think it's good advice for the logical reasons that exist underneath it. And so, for people that are looking like, oh, I want to play with this, the big takeaways there are: one, this is not something you do all the time. Mm-hmm. You do it. Sometimes you do it for short periods of time. You experiment with it to see how that impacts you, because it's going to impact you in a lot of ways. So again, block it out. Maybe it's two weeks worth and we're done. We're going to see how this impacts us. If you already if you already have like an underlying sort of condition, let's just say, you've got some type of osis or apathy, tendonitis, tendinopathy that may be going on. There's some type of an issue. Understand that you are putting the joints in a very exposed position, the soft tissue in a very exposed position when you do this. So it needs to be very controlled, which I would say then is not for the novice exerciser. Unless you're under very close supervision, then you may be able to do this.
And that just made me think about a really, really important note for this. And I see this as an issue when people are trying to work full range, is that end range still needs to have tension in the muscle. Mm-hmm. It's not just letting your arm let your arm hang above your head and then you pull a little bit and then let it hang and turn off. Like, you have to have tension in that lengthened position for it to have that response. Yeah. So I think that's a really, really important note. Make sure even in your lengthened position, it's not a relax, it's an engaged reach or engaged lengthen or engaged whatever position you're in.
Yes, I think, again, just going back, this is very anecdotal, mm-hmm. in a lot of ways. There are some things that we can kind of hang our hat on and go, okay, we kind of know this. We kind of, got to be careful around here or whatever, but we have to be very on top of this. So you need to be very comfortable in the ranges that you're working within as the exerciser, and or be very comfortable as the coach with your client or your athlete or whoever it is that you happen to be working with. Again, at the end of the day, it's like, does this really matter? Like, is this something we should really be focused on in the time that we have? That's up to you, the coach, or you, the exerciser. It's not for us to decide. There's never going to be, a rule for that. You can try this stuff whenever you want. Just to understand, manage your expectations here. So again, the big takeaways there are block this out. Let's not get carried away. Let's not get, think about this. Let's be smart in our approach. Again, going back, the other thing that could be tried here is on your very last set of whatever it is that you're doing, based on kind of what we're looking at here, could there be some benefit in going into a very heavily loaded static stretch for a period of time on your last set of whatever your hypertrophy exercise was for whatever muscle group? Again, there's no science behind this at all, but if you could maybe theorize that could be helpful, maybe. I don't know. That's total speculation, but maybe that's where you try and add some heavily resisted static stretching.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we want random human controlled studies and all this stuff, but you can also kind of randomize, sorry, random or random too. No, randomize, sorry. Controlled human studies, but you can kind of be, especially if you're an experienced lifter, like you can kind of sometimes be your own test subject. Like try it out on your block. Try that intense stretching at the end of your sets. Do you feel like, hey, you're starting to gain more range of motion in your movements, or hey, you are having like, hey, I feel like I'm kind of blowing up a little bit more, and that's really the only variable I've changed. I love to do that kind of stuff with my own training of applying these things in a smart, intentional, effective way, but then and kind of seeing my own response, right? Because the data, as much as we want it, it's always going to be a little bit behind. It is. So I think that's a takeaway as well.
Yeah, it kind of goes back. So we did another episode on overload and training to failure, and some of the stuff that's coming up now and how people are not necessarily training to failure. It doesn't really matter as long as you're training to at or near, reps, sets, volume doesn't necessarily matter as long as you're training to at or near failure. These are all very vague statements. And so the stuff that we've talked about the last couple of times, I think people need to take this as that. Like, we're not trying to make an argument for or against it. We know certain things work. I think it's interesting that they're out there studying, that there's folks out there studying, smart people that are out there studying this stuff that can give us maybe a little bit more insight to it. It certainly gives us something to talk about. But like in terms of programming and where we put this stuff in, let's be real, about what we're doing here. The reason we're talking about it today is because this stuff, the shit, because it is new, seems to take off like wildfire, and you hear all kinds of people doing all kinds of different things with it. And the next thing you know, somebody will be selling some new product based around, here's all the right stretches to do, for these muscles in order to stop it. Don't buy into that. Like, we're not even close to that yet. And the bigger part about this is going to be all very individual. Why we have this one study right now that suggests something specific to the pec. We also can't apply, going back to what we were talking about before, that this is the same for every muscle of the body. Like, because it works on the pec doesn't necessarily mean it works on the gastroc, right? Like, we talked about something different. I was talking about a different study. Like, we learned some things in that previous study that made them then be able to kind of move to the next level, go, okay, we learned a few things. Let's apply this, narrow it down a little bit more, and we'll do the pecs this time and see what happens. The pecs are not the biceps. The biceps are not the lats. The lats are not the quads, right? So just because we've seen something happen at the pec and we saw something similar happen at the gastroc, we were talking about two different things. We're talking about strength, not necessarily hypertrophy. And we may have had some level of change in thickness at the gastroc, and strength. That doesn't necessarily mean it grew, right? So anyway, muscle thickness in certain fibers. The whole point of this is like, if you start taking this way off the deep end, that's where you're going to wind up. You're going to be way off the deep end on this thing. And it's going back to some of the nuance with this study. Again, they were, let's just say, exercise, but very untrained from a hypertrophy perspective individuals. They got to choose what group they wanted to be in, which I thought was interesting. That creates a little bit of a challenge for me, right? Like, there's something to be said about the mental aspect of, and the direction you go, and you're kind of self-selecting there versus letting the scientists or the people that are running the trial or the study do that for you. That's a little bit of a thing in terms of like repeatability of the experiment. Like, if you let people choose,
it's not really random.
It isn't. Yes. How does that impact things? I'm not saying it does or it doesn't. I'm just asking. How does it impact things? So those are things to think about as well.
For sure. And I think like applying this in a way that again, if you sign up for a program or you start working with a coach and you just see that every single exercise is working in this, that's where it's how do we apply this to a small degree? How do we learn from these things? But we don't throw everything else out that we know.
Mm-hmm.
That's the intention with this.
Here's the last interesting point that I'll make about this, and that is for people to understand what's really being kind of looked at here physiologically, which is really fucking interesting to me. And that is we're applying a mechanism, right? An outside mechanism or mechanical force to the body, which then basically at the end of the day turns into a chemical response that helps build muscle tissue. That is wild, right? So we're applying, to me, just in general, thinking about that, like there's not another machine on the planet, that does it the same way that humans do. Animals similar but different in that we can put all these outside mechanical forces on the body, and somehow the body turns this into this physiological response, chemical response. Like what happens? It's switching on all these things down the line. One of which is like this creation, or this release of insulin growth factor, right? Which is this is what's helping you grow or helping those muscles grow. How much mechanical stimulus needs to be given per individual in order to get this particular response over here? And of that, who responds and how do they respond to that particular that IGF response over here on this side? And what are all the other things in between that go into making that really effective? So again, we talk about them all the time, but how does other outside stresses impact this? Your sleep, your nutrition, right? The intention that you're training with, the recovery times that you use in between. I mean, you went back to blocking this training. Like how much can the body take before it just before there's a point of diminishing returns? All answers that we don't have, all questions that we don't have answers to. We do have a lot of answers to a lot of things, and those are the things that we should be focused on. So again, when this stuff comes up, like we'll always try, like if we feel like it's worth talking about, we'll talk about it. And that's kind of why we're doing it here today. The basics that work are the things that we know and that you'll see across the board. There really isn't, nobody's arguing about any of this stuff. The experts tend to agree. We're not trying to argue or be special snowflakes or do anything different. Let's go back to the basic principles that you'll see in any of our regular programming. If you look at RDF Strong, RDF Max, right, our online membership program and all the things that are in there, they are the basics. There are certain things, we talk about them on the show. There are certain rep and set schemes with particular intensity levels that we know by and large have a similar impact on most human beings. The more advanced you get as that human being in your exercise program, the responses that you understand you get or don't get from programs help you be that much more effective at applying these things. So, if you're looking for answers there, you're looking for answers on how to grow more muscle. They're already there, right? This stuff could be very interesting down the line, but please don't get distracted by this. Stick to the basics. Consistency is the thing that's going to get you where you need to go. Number one, stay with the program long enough to see that it works. Doing a 2-week block of this and expecting to understand what it does or what it doesn't do for you this stretch to hypertrophy programming that we're talking about, doing it for a 2-week block and expecting that you're going to understand how it impacts you, rooted in zero logic.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
We've already done a ton of that work for you in our other programs. So again, like Max, Strong, the online membership gives you access to those programs. A lot of people out there have done some really cool stuff. Some other programs, we're certainly not unique in that way. We just like what we've done because we've avoided all this other stuff, brought in what we know as being the good stuff. Anything you guys want to add as we wrap this up?
I would say let's revisit this topic maybe in like 3 to 5 years.
Love it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot more data coming out.
Yeah. And in the meantime, if things pop up in that 3 to 5 years where people are trying to sell this as the new thing and all that, then I reserve the right to have that conversation before and revisit that conversation before.
Mm-hmm.